Did an advanced civilization exist 100,000 years ago? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a place not quite pinned on any map. You might already have your blanket tucked up to your chin, your tea cooling on the nightstand, and that gentle awareness that you should probably be asleep by now. Perfect, because what we're going to do is lean into one of history's most persistent bedtime questions. It's the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a great civilization before. The ones we know. Long before Egypt decided pyramids were an acceptable flex, long before Mesopotamia invented the joy of taxes, even before Stonehenge appeared like a suspiciously symmetrical pile of rocks, the theory goes, perhaps 100,000 years ago, or even more, there was someone out there building things, organizing cities, writing notes to each other, maybe even complaining about rent. And then it all disappeared, which is either a tantalizing mystery or exactly the kind of thing archaeologists groan about when they check their emails. Let's sink into it slowly. Of course, the mainstream view, the one your high school history teacher tried to drill into. Is that complex civilization only really shows up around 10,000 years ago. Agriculture, permanent settlements, surplus grain, and the unfortunate rise of bureaucracy. Before that, everyone's just supposed to be nomadic, hunting, gathering, and hoping not to get eaten by something with too many teeth. But here's the trouble. Humans, or at least very human-like hominins, have been around for much longer. Homo sapiens, our own somewhat anxious brand, go back nearly 300,000 years. Neanderthals were around, Denisovans too, and maybe a few other cousins whose bones we haven't found yet, so we've had plenty of time to get up to mischief, which makes some people ask, why wait so long before building anything impressive? Surely someone, somewhere, could have gotten a head start. This is where the whispers of a lost advanced civilization begin. Now, the phrase advanced civilization tends to conjure up images of Atlantis. Glittering cities, perhaps with slightly too many crystals, before being swallowed by the sea because Poseidon was having a mood. Plato is largely to blame here. Around 360 BCE, he writes a dialogue about Atlantis, supposedly destroyed 9,000 years before his time. A great empire wiped out in a single day and night. Very dramatic. Historians generally nod politely and say, yes, Plato, lovely metaphor, very clever allegory for the dangers of hubris, nothing to see here. But once the idea gets into popular imagination, it never really leaves. By the 19th century, people were writing entire books trying to prove Atlantis was real. In the 20th century, it morphed into ancient aliens. And now, in the 21st, it's mostly YouTube thumbnails featuring pyramids, glowing eyes and fonts that scream conspiracy. But beneath the neon graphics, there is a quieter question worth asking. Could traces of something older have slipped past? As one challenge with deep history is erosion, nature is an excellent housekeeper. Give her 100,000 years and she'll sweep away almost everything. Wood rots, metal corrodes, even stone wears down. The ruins we marvel at today, like the Parthenon or the Colosseum, are only a couple thousand years old and already look like they've had a very long week. Stretch that out to 100 millennia, and you're not left with much. So, if some group of early humans did manage to organize themselves into a society with buildings, trade, maybe even governance, most of the evidence would be gone by now. That's the haunting thought. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Archaeologists, understandably cautious people, don't love that line of reasoning. But for bedtime history, it's irresistible. Let's drift toward one of the more intriguing sites often dragged into this discussion. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in the 1990s in southeastern Turkey. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circles, some carved with animals and abstract symbols. It dates back at least 11,000 years, which for perspective is about 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. At the time, humans were supposed to still be fumbling with farming. Yet here they were, hauling multi-ton stones, carving them with surprising skill, and apparently gathering for rituals of some sort. Archaeologists admit this was unexpected. They had thought temples came after agriculture, not before, and yet there it was, monumental architecture by people who, theoretically, were still meant to be chasing deer around. Now, does Göbekli Tepe prove an advanced lost civilization from 100,000 years ago? No, but it does demonstrate that our ancestors were capable of much more, much earlier, than previously assumed. And once that door creaks open, it's tempting to peer inside. Let's pause for a breath here, because if you're listening in, bed, I'd like you to notice the weight of your blanket, the way your breathing has slowed a little, and the steady rhythm of words drifting along. History has a way of doing that, drawing you out of the present and into a hazy elsewhere. Back to the mystery. Another piece of evidence often waved around in late-night documentaries is the so-called out-of-place artifact. Things that appear inconveniently where they shouldn't, like a hammer encased in rock supposedly hundreds of millions of years old, or tiny gold figurines in Colombia that look suspiciously like airplanes, or the Antikythera mechanism, a complex gear device pulled from a shipwreck in the Aegean, dating to around 100 BCE. Of these, only the Antikythera mechanism survives rigorous scrutiny. It's real, it's ancient, and it's shockingly sophisticated. An astronomical calculator with bronze gears that predict eclipses. When it was first studied, scholars were baffled. Nothing like it should have existed in that era. It was, in effect, a pocket planetarium in a box. But it was not from 100,000 years ago. It was from ancient Greece, which already had a habit of producing things inconveniently ahead of schedule. The hammer in rock, probably just a 19th century tool encased in concretion. The airplane figurines, more likely stylized birds and insects. Which leaves us, again, with tantalizing maybes, but no smoking gun. But maybe we're looking in the wrong places. If an advanced society did exist so long ago, it may not have looked like ours. We tend to imagine skyscrapers and steel bridges, but perhaps their achievements were subtler, less durable. Advanced navigation, for instance, leaves few archaeological traces. Sophisticated oral traditions vanish when the last speaker dies. Even medicine, if based on plants, can disappear without leaving fossils. In this sense, advanced may not mean industrial. It may mean simply organized, complex, and thriving in ways we don't yet grasp. Picture a civilization living along coasts now drowned by rising seas. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower, exposing vast tracts of land. As the ice melted, those shorelines disappeared. If early societies clustered there, most of their ruins are now underwater, hidden beneath layers of silt and coral. Which makes you wonder, how much history lies beneath the waves, quietly unreachable? Naturally, when this possibility is raised, people tend to leap to aliens. Because if humans couldn't have done it, surely someone from another planet dropped by with architectural blueprints and a spare laser beam. But this theory is not only unnecessary, it's also rather insulting to the creativity of our ancestors. They had the same brains we do. In fact, slightly larger on average. Give them time, motivation, and a good stretch of boredom, and they could invent astonishing things. The problem is, very few survive the wear of deep time. That's why archaeologists cling tightly to what they can measure. Pottery shards, burial sites, seeds charred in ancient hearths, little fragments, but enough to reconstruct a story. And so far, that story points to gradual development, not sudden leaps. Still, the gaps remain. The long stretches where human history feels like a black screen with a blinking cursor. And in those gaps, our imagination builds palaces. Let's drift over now to the realm of myth. Nearly every culture has some memory of a flood. Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh tells of the gods drowning the world. The Bible echoes it with Noah's Ark. Ancient Indian texts speak of Manu, warned of a great deluge by a fish. In Mesoamerica, too, floods appear in origin stories. Is this coincidence or the faded echo of real events? As the Ice Age ended, seas did rise dramatically. Entire coastal areas vanished. People would have witnessed it, slowly but devastatingly. Villages drowned, fertile land lost. Over generations, those memories may have hardened into myth, and when told around fires, the stories would naturally grow grander until they became tales of whole civilizations swept away. Atlantis, then, could be less allegory and more cultural. Memory refracted and exaggerated over millennia. Not an empire with flying ships, but perhaps just an unfortunate fishing community swallowed by the sea. Still tragic, just less cinematic. There's also the quiet fact that humans are forgetful. Empires rise and fall, and the next generation often acts as if nothing came before. The Library of Alexandria burns, and centuries of knowledge vanish into smoke. Mayan scribes are silenced, their codices destroyed by conquistadors. If that can happen in just a few hundred years, imagine what can be erased in tens of thousands. The fragile web of royal inbreeding. Let's drift forward now, away from half-imagined civilizations at the bottom of the sea, into the far more documented disasters of European royal family trees. Because while we may never know if Atlantis was real, we do know that for centuries, monarchs absolutely refused to marry outside of their own cousins. And unlike Atlantis, we have the portraits to prove it. When you think of royalty, you're supposed to imagine majesty, gleaming crowns, velvet robes, and a general sense of superiority. What you're not supposed to imagine is a chin so oversized, it could double as a shelf. Yet here we are, staring down the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs were very good at one thing, keeping their empire large. They were not, however, very good at keeping their gene pool diverse. Over generations, the family perfected the art of marrying close relatives, mostly because it was easier than negotiating with strangers. The result was a dynasty held together by treaties, wealth, and the occasional alarming jawline. Let's settle into one particular case study, Charles II of Spain. Charles II, sometimes called the Bewitched, was born in 1661. He was king, practically from the cradle, which would have been fine, except his cradle was positioned at the absolute end of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Geneticists today have actually mapped his family tree, and it's the kind of diagram that makes you want to lie down. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents also close relatives. By the time Charles was born, his pedigree chart looked less like a branching tree and more like a tangled knot someone had given up trying to untangle. The results showed in his health. Charles was physically frail, mentally slow by contemporary accounts, and plagued with medical issues. He couldn't speak properly until the age of 4, couldn't walk until 8, and lived a life shadowed by illness. Contemporaries often described him as more ghost than monarch, and then there was the jaw. The Habsburg jaw, as it became known, was a protruding lower mandible inherited generation after generation. On portraits it appears almost cartoonish. On Charles, it was so pronounced that he struggled to chew food. He was also nearly toothless, which didn't help. Nicknamed the Hexed One, his own subjects whispered that witchcraft was involved. But in truth, the culprit was genetics. Charles's reign, predictably, did not go well. He was incapable of producing an heir, which, for a monarch, is the one job description you can't really outsource. He spent much of his life in pain, attended by quack doctors and courtiers, more concerned with power than his well-being. By the time he died in 1700, aged only 38, the Habsburg line in Spain died with him. His autopsy, written in grim detail, reported that his body was not complete. His intestines were rotted, his lungs consumed, his heart the size of a peppercorn, and his head full of water. It reads less like medical notes and more like a horror inventory. Naturally, his death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, because nothing says rest in peace, quite like several nations immediately fighting over your empty throne. But Charles was hardly unique. Royal inbreeding was practically a European pastime. The logic was simple. Marry within the family, and you keep the crown, the land, and the money neatly contained. Outsiders, far too risky. Unfortunately, what they gained in political control, they lost in basic biology. Take the Egyptian Ptolemies, for instance. These were the descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, who decided Egypt looked like a decent retirement. And plan. They ruled for nearly 300 years, during which time they married siblings almost as a matter of policy. Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, was the product of generations of sibling unions, which may explain why so many Ptolemaic rulers seemed to die suspiciously young or displayed fragile health. If the family tree of the Habsburgs looks tangled, the Ptolemies tree looks more like a circle. The irony here is that these dynasties considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization. They wore crowns heavy enough to cause neck strain, issued proclamations in flowery language, and expected subjects to bow low in reverence. Meanwhile, their private lives looked like a tragic biology experiment. Sometimes the inbreeding didn't result in obvious deformities. Instead, it produced subtler frailties, hemophilia, epilepsy, or just a general tendency to die inconveniently young. The Russian royal family, the Romanovs, learned this the hard way. When Tsar Nicholas II's son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, the family turned desperately to the mystic Rasputin for help. It didn't end well, which brings us to the darker reality. When royalty suffered, they often dragged entire nations into crisis with them. A single weak heir could mean war, famine, or dynastic collapse. The private misfortunes of one family rippled outward, reshaping history. Let's drift briefly to the Tudors. Everyone remembers Henry VIII for his 6 wives, but not enough attention is given to his children. Edward VI, his only son, became king at 9 and died at 15, most likely of tuberculosis. Mary I, his eldest daughter, struggled with phantom pregnancies, possibly due to reproductive disorders. Elizabeth I lived longer, but never produced an heir. By the end, the Tudor line fizzled out, leaving the throne to the Scottish Stuarts. Dynasties often collapsed this way, not through great battles, but through fragile bodies. All the pomp, the castles, the elaborate portraits, undone by anemia, infertility, or some unlucky chromosome. It's tempting to feel pity for these royals, and to an extent, we should. They were human beings caught in webs of expectation, forced into marriages chosen for them, and then blamed when nature refused to cooperate. But it's also hard not to notice the irony. These were families ruling entire nations, dictating the lives of millions, yet they couldn't seem to dictate their own health. The more one studies royal history, the more it feels like a slow-motion tragedy. Carefully groomed heirs, presented to the world as symbols of divine right, who turn out to be pale, sickly, and sometimes utterly incapable of ruling. The contrast between the grandeur of their palaces and the fragility of their bodies is almost comical, almost. If you're drifting towards sleep right now, let that image settle. The velvet curtains, the gilded thrones, the ceremonial processions, all concealing families who could barely survive their own genetics. Behind the fanfare were fragile bones, failing organs, and endless worries about whether the next baby would live long enough to be christened. Royal history is less a story of triumph, and more a reminder that privilege does not equal health. For all their crowns and titles, many of these kings and queens lived shorter, more miserable lives than their own peasants. Petty thrones and royal meltdowns. Let's drift further into the quieter, pettier corners of history. Because if fragile genetics shaped dynasties, fragile egos often destroyed them. Kings and queens were supposed to embody majesty. They were meant to stand taller, shine brighter, and make decisions with grace. Instead, they often behaved like sulky children arguing over toys, the toys, in this case, being entire countries. Consider Richard II of England. Born in 1367, he inherited the throne at just 10 years old, which already feels like a bad start, since most 10-year-olds can barely manage their own handwriting, let alone a kingdom. Richard grew up to be, how shall we put it, delicate. He liked art, he liked fashion, and he was fond of surrounding himself with flatterers. All fine hobbies, except that he also had a violent temper and a tendency to interpret criticism as treason. One story claims that when a nobleman criticized his rule, Richard slapped him in public. Not exactly the sign of steady leadership. He later had the man executed. Subtlety was not Richard's strong suit. Eventually, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke had enough, invaded England, and forced Richard to abdicate. Richard spent the rest of his life locked away, sulking in a castle until he died, probably starved. His reign left the kingdom unstable, nudging England toward the Wars of the Roses, all because a king couldn't take criticism without throwing a tantrum. Now let's drift sideways to France, because no survey of royal meltdowns is complete without Charles VI. Charles became king in 1380 at the age of 11. For a while, things looked promising. He was nicknamed the Beloved, but then, as often happened with medieval monarchs, reality intervened. At 25, Charles suffered a mental breakdown. During one military expedition, he suddenly drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several before he was restrained. Afterward, his mind never fully returned. From then on, he was called Charles the Mad. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass, shattering if anyone touched him. Other times, he forgot his own name. He'd run screaming through palace halls or fail to recognize his wife. He banned people from touching him, lest they crack him, which must have made daily life awkward. Naturally, France fell into chaos under his reign. Nobles schemed, foreign powers invaded, and the monarchy limped along under a man convinced he was a fragile vase. Petty quarrels weren't just about personality, though. Sometimes they were about fashion. Take Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. Louis was obsessed with appearance. He built Versailles not as a practical residence, but as the world's most extravagant stage set. Nobles had to compete for the honor of watching him put on his socks each morning. Yes, his socks. It was a ritual called the lever, and courtiers jockeyed for the privilege of handing him clothing items. Louis understood power, but he also understood pettiness. By making nobles fight for his attention over trivial matters, he kept them too busy to plot against him. It worked, but it also created a royal court where the stakes were measured not in policy, but in proximity to a sock. Of course, Louis XIV wasn't the only one to weaponize fashion. Across Europe, monarchs used style as a form of warfare. Elizabeth I of England reportedly owned over 2,000 gowns. She treated appearances like battle strategy, projecting majesty through pearls, wigs, and enough white face powder to qualify as a walking ghost. The irony is that her favorite cosmetic, lead-based makeup slowly poisoned her. By the end of her life, she had blackened teeth, thinning hair, and skin that required ever thicker layers of powder to conceal. But at least she remained intimidating. Royal meltdowns also extended to family squabbles. Take the case of Frederick William the Fat of Prussia and his son, the future Frederick the Great. Frederick William was nicknamed the Soldier King. He loved the military. He adored discipline. He even created a regiment of unusually tall soldiers known as his giant guard, because apparently height was the true measure of glory. His son Frederick, however, loved music, philosophy, and French poetry. To Frederick William, this was unacceptable. He beat his son, humiliated him, and at one point tried to force him into military service. Frederick attempted to run away with a friend. They were caught. His father had the friend executed and forced Frederick to watch. Not exactly a hallmark father-son moment. Eventually, Frederick inherited the throne anyway, proving far more competent than his father ever imagined. But the scars of that childhood lingered. The kingdom may have gained a brilliant ruler, but at the cost of a deeply damaged human being. Let's drift to another continent for a moment, because Europe doesn't hold a monopoly on royal disasters. In China, the Ming dynasty produced the Wanli Emperor, who ruled from 1572 to 1620. Wanli began with energy and promise, but after a few decades, he grew tired of governing. Very tired. He simply stopped attending court meetings altogether. For nearly 30 years, he refused to engage in state affairs. Ministers begged him, threatened him, even wept before him. Wanli shrugged and stayed in bed. The empire continued on autopilot, slowly fraying at the edges until rebellion and invasion set in. Wanli's withdrawal left the dynasty weakened beyond repair. Sometimes neglect is just as destructive as tantrums. Then there's Christian VII of Denmark. Another case of royal fragility, but this time mixed with spectacular immaturity. Christian ascended the throne in 1766 at age 17. He quickly developed a taste for drinking, debauchery, and practical jokes. He'd slap nobles, run through the palace smashing windows, and force courtiers to jump like frogs for his amusement. He once assaulted a prostitute in public, simply to shock his entourage. Over time, Christian slipped further into mental illness, likely schizophrenia. Real power shifted to his physician, Johann Struensee, who became both de facto ruler and lover of the Queen. The court spiraled into scandal, ending with Struensee executed and Christian sidelined. Denmark was technically still a monarchy, but run more like a tragic farce. What these stories share is not just royal instability, but the way entire nations had to live with it. When a king sulked, people starved. When a queen obsessed over fashion, taxes rose. When an heir was weak or a ruler went mad, wars followed. Ordinary citizens, who had no say in the matter, found their lives dictated by the meltdowns of people whose biggest qualification was birth. It's a reminder that history isn't shaped solely by grand ideals. Often, it's shaped by human pettiness, jealousy, and the inability to share toys. The same impulses that start sibling fights in kitchens started wars across Europe. Now, as you sink further into rest, let the images soften. Kings screaming that they're made of glass, nobles fighting for the honor of touching a sock, emperors who simply refused to get out of bed. Behind the pomp and the titles, history is full of fragile people, making fragile choices while wearing crowns that sat much too heavy on their heads. And with that, we can drift toward our next chapter, the strange habits of royals. Because if tantrums shaped kingdoms, the daily routines of monarchs were no less bizarre. From bathing superstitions to dietary obsessions, history's elite had personal quirks that were equal parts fascinating and absurd. Strange habits of monarchs. Now that we've floated through inbred dynasties and royal tantrums, let's settle into something a little quieter, the everyday habits of monarchs. Because if you've ever felt slightly embarrassed about your own strange bedtime rituals, I promise you, history's kings and queens were much, much stranger. Take Louis XIV again, the Sun King. We already know about his obsession with socks and ceremonies. But Louis also had a habit of inviting physicians to watch him use the bathroom. Yes, his bowel movements were treated like minor state occasions. Courtiers stood by as doctors analyzed his digestion, nodding gravely, because the king's intestines were considered national business, and this wasn't unique. Across Europe, royals blurred the line between public duty and private function. Their bodies weren't just theirs, they were political symbols. If the king was healthy, the nation was stable. If he sneezed, courtiers panicked. So naturally, everyone paid far too much attention to royal digestion. Speaking of hygiene, or the lack of it, let's drift over to England's Queen Elizabeth I. Despite her regal image, Elizabeth wasn't much for bathing. Once a month was considered plenty. Some records suggest she even bragged about this, which tells you all you need to know about Tudor-era standards. Imagine the layers of perfume, the mountains of face powder, and the sheer determination required to smell royal. Her father, Henry VIII, wasn't much better. Toward the end of his life, he became so obese that special machinery had to hoist him onto his horse. His legs ulcerated, leaking pus that required constant dressing. Yet he continued to see himself as a handsome knight. A reminder that kings were as delusional about their bodies as anyone scrolling through filters today. Bathing itself was often treated with suspicion. Medieval Europeans worried that warm water opened the pores, letting in diseases. So, while peasants sometimes washed in rivers, nobles often avoided water altogether, preferring to layer on perfumes. Louis XIII of France was reportedly bathed only twice in his entire life. Twice, which makes you wonder how his courtiers managed to breathe in his presence without fainting. Contrast that with the Ottomans, whose sultans luxuriated in elaborate bathhouses. For them, cleanliness was a sign of refinement. The divide is striking. While one half of Europe was marinating in musk, the other side of the Mediterranean was steaming, scrubbing, and emerging actually fresh. Eating habits were equally peculiar. Consider Peter the Great of Russia. A man of enormous energy, Peter had equally enormous appetites. He drank heavily, sometimes competitively, and thought nothing of forcing his courtiers into drinking contests that ended in spectacular collapse. He was also fascinated by dentistry. He carried his own tools and occasionally extracted teeth from his unfortunate companions, storing them as souvenirs. Imagine being summoned to dinner, only to leave with one fewer molar. Some habits were less grotesque, but still telling. King George III of Britain, later infamous for bouts of madness, had a fondness for farming. He spent hours discussing manure, crop rotations, and the finer points of turnip cultivation. His subjects mocked him as Farmer George. But beneath the ridicule, he was genuinely interested in agricultural reform. So while his dynasty crumbled toward revolution abroad, George was happily debating soil quality. Others preferred more whimsical obsessions. King Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire collected curiosities with manic enthusiasm. His palace in Prague overflowed with stuffed animals, crystals, alchemical instruments, and supposed relics. He kept astrologers and magicians on payroll, and he adored mechanical toys. Visitors found his court equal parts magical and chaotic, like a child's playroom expanded to imperial scale. Politics bored him, but a new automaton bird? That was worth his attention. Sometimes royal quirks were deadly serious. Take the case of James VI of Scotland, who later became James the Cur of England. James was terrified of witches, absolutely convinced they were everywhere, plotting his downfall. He even wrote a book, Demonology, detailing how to identify and prosecute them. His paranoia fueled witch hunts across Scotland, leading to countless executions. It's a sobering reminder that a monarch's personal fears could become national policy. When kings believed in witches, people burned. Other rulers were obsessed with omens. Roman emperors, for instance, often refused to make decisions without consulting augurs, priests who interpreted the will of the gods through bird behavior. If the chickens pecked grain in a certain way, war might proceed. If the birds refused to eat, everything paused. Imagine an empire spanning thousands of miles, its fate determined by the appetite of a chicken. Let's drift to a quieter habit: sleep. Napoleon Bonaparte famously bragged he only needed 4 hours a night, which sounds impressive, until you realize he compensated with constant naps, collapsing mid-meeting, mid-carriage ride, even mid-battle. He was less a superhuman than a man addicted to power napping. On the opposite side, Charles IX of France reportedly slept with dozens of hunting dogs in his bedchamber, which might explain why he never quite looked rested. And then there were dietary oddities. King Henry V of England supposedly died from eating a surfeit of lampreys. Lampreys are eel-like creatures, not exactly designed for binge eating. But Henry adored them. Against doctors' orders, he consumed a feast of them, fell violently ill, and promptly died. His personal cravings, indulged without moderation, ended his reign. Centuries later, William Howard Taft, President of the United States, had similar trouble with overindulgence. Though not technically royal, his legendary girth became part of White House law. He once got stuck in a bathtub. It had to be pried out, along with his dignity, proof, perhaps, that gluttonous habits spared no form of leader. Let's not forget Maria Theresa of Austria. She gave birth to 16 children, which was less habit than relentless duty, but remarkable nonetheless. Her daily life revolved around pregnancy, recovery, and then more pregnancy. Among her brood was Marie Antoinette, who inherited more style than sense. Maria Theresa's maternal routine shaped Europe's dynastic map for generations. One woman's womb became international policy. Sometimes habits shaded into superstition. Many monarchs clung to relics for luck. Edward, the Confessor of England, carried a ring, supposedly given to him by St. John the Evangelist. French kings were believed to heal scrofula, a disease of the lymph nodes, by touching sufferers. Crowds lined up for the royal healing touch, convinced of its power. It was less medical science, more theatre, but for centuries it reassured subjects that their rulers were semi-divine. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at these oddities. Kings afraid of witches, queens reluctant to bathe, emperors obsessed with clockwork toys. But there's a quieter truth here. Habits reveal humanity. These rulers, wrapped in ceremony, still clung to quirks and fears, just like anyone else. They chewed too much lamprey, hoarded too many crystals, or refused to get out of bed. Crown or no crown, they were human beings with peculiar comfort zones. So, as you drift now beneath your blanket, perhaps with your own small rituals, the extra sip of water, the precise fold of a pillow, know that you're in royal company. If Charles VI could believe he was made of glass, and Louis XIV could host an audience during his bowel movements, then surely your habits are positively noble by comparison. Sickly, spoiled and sad, royal childhoods, let's sink now into the nurseries of the past. Behind the silk curtains, behind the gilded cribs, royal children often lived lives that looked enviable from the outside and utterly miserable from within. Because while peasants grew up scrambling in the mud, royal heirs were raised in cages made of gold. Lavish cages, yes, but cages all the same. Consider the childhood of poor Charles II of Spain, the bewitched king we already drifted past. His childhood was less a childhood and more a prolonged medical emergency. The boy couldn't walk until the age of 8, and even then he tottered like a reed in the wind. His tutors gave up on serious education, instead teaching him just enough to parrot prayers. Portraits show him in frilly outfits, gazing blankly, as if already aware that life was going to be unkind. Instead of running in fields or playing games, Charles spent his days surrounded by worried courtiers, superstitious priests, and anxious doctors prodding him. A childhood of constant whispers about curses and heredity. Little wonder he grew into a man who looked haunted. But sickliness wasn't the only hazard. Sometimes royal children were simply spoiled beyond recognition. Take Louis XV of France. As a boy, he was so pampered that servants carried him everywhere. When he finally tried walking on his own, his legs gave out from lack of practice. Imagine an heir to the throne, toppled by the radical concept of standing upright. This sort of overindulgence was common. Heirs were rarely told no. Every whim, however small, became policy. Toys, tutors, pets, exotic sweets, all provided instantly. The problem was that these children eventually grew up to rule entire countries, while still expecting the world to obey like a nanny with an endless toy chest. Royal nurseries were also profoundly lonely. Princes and princesses weren't allowed to mingle with ordinary children. Their playmates were carefully selected nobles, often more interested in currying favor than genuine fun. Imagine being 5 years old, trying to play tag, while your friend is silently calculating how to leverage your game of hide-and-seek into a family promotion. Some were raised almost entirely by servants, rarely seeing their parents. Monarchs were too busy ruling or too busy scheming to bother with childcare. For example, Elizabeth I barely remembered her mother, Anne Boleyn, who was executed when Elizabeth was just 2. She grew up shuttled between households, under constant suspicion, with no stable parental presence. It shaped her into a fiercely independent woman, but also one who trusted almost no one. And then there were the endless tutors. Royal children were expected to absorb languages, theology, history, philosophy, and military training before most modern kids master long division. Edward VI of England, the frail son of Henry VIII, was drilled relentlessly in Latin and Greek. He was praised as a prodigy, but his health couldn't keep up with his studies. By 15, he was dead, leaving behind neat handwriting, impressive essays, and very little else. Education was both blessing and burden. Catherine the Great of Russia recalled her childhood studies as constant pressure, with governesses scolding her for every slip. She eventually turned her sharp mind into political power, but her childhood was one long rehearsal for never feeling enough. Sometimes childhood dangers were less about tutors and more about politics. Consider Ivan the Terrible of Russia. Born in 1530, he lost his father at 3. His mother was poisoned when he was 8. From then on, Ivan grew up surrounded by violent noble families, the boy treated as both pawn and obstacle. At 13, he responded by having one of his tormentors thrown to a pack of hunting dogs. Childhood trauma expressed with teeth. The boy who grew up in paranoia became the man who built an empire on terror. His childhood was less a nursery, more a training ground for cruelty. Even the seemingly privileged faced constant health risks. Infant mortality was cruelly high, even for royals. Catherine de' Medici gave birth to 10 children, but only a few lived long enough to make political marriages. Queen Anne of England endured an especially tragic fate. 17 pregnancies, and resulting in a surviving heir. Her nurseries were full of loss. The grief shaped her reign, her moods, and her very sense of purpose. For children who did survive, illnesses still loomed. Smallpox scarred faces and claimed lives. Measles, fevers, and infections spread through palaces as easily as through villages. The difference was that royal deaths were public tragedies. A peasant child dying was common. A royal child dying could spark dynastic crisis, which meant even play was dangerous. Heirs were often swaddled in protective rules. Don't climb, don't run, don't catch cold. They were treated less as children and more as fragile symbols of continuity. Fun was secondary to survival. Of course, not all royal childhoods were sad. Some found joy in peculiar ways. Young Marie Antoinette, before the revolution made her a symbol, spent her Austrian childhood playing in miniature villages built for her amusement. She would dress as a shepherdess, tending fake sheep, pretending to live a simpler life. It was sweet in its way. Also, profoundly tone-deaf, given that real peasants didn't have the luxury of pretending. Similarly, the young Louis XVI of France was shy, fond of locks and keys. He spent hours tinkering in workshops, fiddling with mechanisms. When he became king, his passion for locks remained. Unfortunately, his kingdom required a locksmith with political sense. Looking further afield, child emperors in China and Japan faced their own strange upbringings. The Chinese Kangxi emperor ascended at age 7. His early years were micromanaged by regents, but he quickly showed intelligence and independence. Still, he grew up in a world where every gesture mattered, every word was recorded, and mistakes could topple dynasties. A childhood under surveillance. Japanese emperors, meanwhile, were often symbolic from birth. Their childhoods were cloaked in ritual, their lives choreographed like theatre. Play was secondary to ceremony. Imagine learning to bow properly before you learned to tie your shoes. If there's a thread running through these stories, it's that royal children rarely had the luxury of being children. Their toys were symbolic, their tutors relentless, their friends political. They were raised less as individuals and more as vessels for dynasties. The results were predictable. Adults who were fragile, spoiled, paranoid, or desperate to assert themselves. Some became tyrants, others became melancholic figureheads. A few managed to rise above their beginnings, but even they carried the scars of childhoods warped by power. So as you lie back now, perhaps remembering your own childhood, whether it was full of freedom or discipline, know that at least you didn't have courtiers monitoring your every sneeze. You weren't forbidden from climbing trees in case your lineage broke a bone. You weren't forced into Latin drills before breakfast. Compared to the golden cages of royal nurseries, your own upbringing was likely far more human. Royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong. Hey again, let's settle in. The candles are low, the blankets are warm, and we're about to drift through the grand halls of matrimony. Or rather, through the wreckage of dynastic marriages that were doomed from the moment someone signed the treaty, because when it came to royalty, marriage wasn't about love, it was about power, territory, and keeping bloodlines pure. Naturally, they made it worse. Let's begin with one of history's most famous disasters, Philip the Good of Spain and Mary Flynn of England. Mary, known to later Protestants as Bloody Mary, was determined to restore Catholicism in England. She also wanted an heir, desperately. Her choice was Philip, son of Charles V. He was younger, foreign, and not remotely interested in her. Their marriage treaty was full of fine print, ensuring Philip couldn't seize the English throne outright. But the optics were terrible. The English people loathed him. Mary, meanwhile, convinced herself she was pregnant, twice. Both were phantom pregnancies, complete with swollen belly and court celebrations. Except there was no baby. Philip spent more time abroad than with her, and when Mary died childless, in 1558, he reportedly said he felt more relieved than bereaved. A marriage that produced no heir, only disappointment. But Philip wasn't done with awkward matches. He later married his own niece. Because of course he did. Royal families by this time resembled a recycling program gone terribly wrong. Everyone marrying cousins, nieces, uncles, second cousins twice removed. If it looked like family, it probably was. The genetic consequences piled up. Which brings us neatly to Charles II of Spain, Mary, and Philip's descendant. The product of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, Charles looked less like a monarch and more like a medical warning label. He couldn't chew properly, couldn't speak clearly, and suffered countless ailments. By the time of his death, his autopsy revealed a heart the size of a peppercorn and a body ravaged by hereditary damage. His marriage, arranged naturally, produced no children. The dynasty sputtered out with him. So, yes, that worked out about as well as expected. But sometimes the disasters weren't genetic, just emotional catastrophes. Take Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They were teenagers when married, a French king-to-be and an Austrian archduchess meant to cement peace between two uneasy neighbors. Louis was shy, socially awkward, and obsessed with locks and keys. Marie Antoinette was outgoing, frivolous, and utterly unprepared for the French court's toxic politics. And then there was the bedroom issue. For 7 years their marriage went unconsummated. Courtiers gossiped endlessly, pamphlets mocked them, Europe's rumour mill had a field day. Eventually, after medical advice, some encouragement from Marie's brother, and probably a lot of blushing, things were sorted out. But by then, public opinion had already turned on her. Their mismatched temperaments, combined with bad timing and worse politics, helped pave the way to the revolution. Their marriage was supposed to unite empires. Instead, it symbolized everything wrong with monarchy itself. Another French tale, Louis XIV and Maria Theresa of Spain. Their union was meant to end decades of warfare. She brought a large dowry, or was supposed to. Unfortunately, Spain didn't quite pay up. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, decided treaties were more flexible than promises and went to war anyway. Their marriage, though outwardly polite, was overshadowed by his endless mistresses. Maria Theresa endured quietly, as royal wives were. Expected to. She bore him 6 children, only one of whom survived to adulthood. A sad ratio, even for the time. Her death at just 44 left Louis allegedly guilty for neglecting her. Though perhaps not too guilty, since he married his mistress afterward. England offers plenty of material. Let's pause on Henry VIII, the king, whose marital record reads like a grim nursery rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, endured decades of failed pregnancies and lost children, producing only Mary. Henry grew frustrated, annulled the marriage, and broke with Rome in the process. His second, Anne Boleyn, fared even worse, accused of adultery and executed after failing to give him a son. By the time he reached his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, Henry was obese, foul-tempered, and prone to open sores. She essentially acted as his nurse until his death. Henry's marriages were meant to secure heirs. Instead, they produced religious upheaval, political chaos, and a reputation that still echoes centuries later. Then we have the tragicomic saga of George IV of Britain and Caroline of Brunswick. George, spoiled and self-indulgent, was pressured into marrying Caroline for dynastic reasons. The two met for the first time just before their wedding. His reaction? He called for brandy. Her reaction? She found him fat and unattractive. The marriage collapsed almost immediately. George spent the wedding night drunk on the floor. Caroline, isolated and mocked, left the country. Years later, when George became king, he tried to bar her from his coronation. Crowds cheered for her anyway, turning it into a public humiliation. For him, their union gave Britain plenty of gossip, but very little dignity. Not to be outdone, the Russian royals managed their own spectacular mismatches. Consider Peter III and Catherine the Great. Peter, heir to the throne, adored Prussia, toy soldiers and military parades. Catherine adored books, strategy, and frankly, not him. Their marriage was loveless from the start. Peter neglected her, played with dolls, and reportedly sang German songs off-key while drunk. Catherine, ambitious and clever, decided to secure power another way. When Peter finally inherited the throne, his bizarre behavior and obsession with Frederick the Great alienated everyone. Catherine staged a coup, and Peter was deposed after just 6 months. He later died mysteriously in captivity. Catherine reigned for decades, proving that sometimes a disastrous marriage could still produce a very effective monarch, just not the husband. Elsewhere in Europe, marriage sometimes went wrong before the vows were even spoken. Josephine and Napoleon, for example, were infatuated at first. But when Josephine failed to give him a son, Napoleon had the marriage annulled. He remarried Marie-Louise of Austria, hoping for an heir, and got one. Unfortunately, his empire collapsed not long after. Josephine, meanwhile, lived comfortably at her estate, beloved by many, while Napoleon's dynastic hopes evaporated. So much for grand strategy through matrimony. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that these marriages, arranged for power, often undermined the very dynasties they were meant to secure. Inbreeding weakened heirs. Political unions bred resentment. Loveless marriages produced instability. The personal really was political, and in monarchy the bedroom was the engine of history. As we drift now towards sleep, it's worth remembering. Royal weddings weren't fairy tales. They were chess moves. The smiling portraits hid fragile bodies, unhappy hearts, and dynasties collapsing under their own genetic weight. So the next time you see a glittering royal wedding on television, with carriages and choirs and carefully rehearsed kisses, you might think back to Charles II's Habsburg jaw, or Mary Tudor's phantom pregnancies, or George IV rolling drunk on his wedding night. Because behind every polished balcony wave, history whispers a reminder. The crown was heavy, and the marriages beneath it were rarely happy. The pettiest habits and quirks of royals. Hey everyone, if you're still with me, the room is probably dark now. Maybe you've shifted into a more comfortable spot. Tonight we're floating through a different side of monarchy. The small, strange behaviors that filled the downtime of kings and queens, because running an empire, or at least pretending to, leaves a lot of hours in the day, and royals had to fill them somehow. Some chose hunting or falconry. Others preferred tantrums, odd diets, or collecting items that would make even the most eccentric grandmother blush. Let's drift through a few of them. We can start with Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. Known for his grandeur, he also had peculiar habits when it came to hygiene, or more accurately, the lack of it. Louis famously took only a handful of baths in his lifetime, preferring instead to be doused in perfume. His court followed suit, creating what was essentially the world's most expensive cloud of body odor. Versailles must have smelled like a strange combination of flowers, sweat, and cooked meat. He also insisted on daily rituals of dressing and undressing in front of an audience. Courtiers fought for the privilege of handing him a sleeve or a shoe. Imagine waking up and immediately being surrounded by dozens of people watching you put on socks. Louis loved it. He believed it reinforced his divine majesty. To everyone else, it probably reinforced the idea that their ruler was a bit ridiculous. Now let's float over to King George III of Britain. He is best remembered for losing the American colonies and for his mental health struggles. But he also had a softer obsession, farming. George adored agriculture to the point that he earned the nickname Farmer George. While his ministers discussed global politics, he might be found examining turnips, cows, or manure. To his critics, this was evidence of his simplicity. To supporters, it showed his connection to the land. Either way, one can picture him gently, patting a sheep while an aide nervously clears his throat to remind him that Parliament is in crisis. Of course, his later illness made him behave more erratically, talking non-stop, giving orders to invisible subjects, and once shaking hands with a tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. Still, even before his decline, he found more joy in livestock than in politics, perhaps not the worst preference given how politics usually went. Across the Channel, Queen Christina of Sweden stands out. Christina reigned in the 17th century and baffled her court with her eccentric lifestyle. She dressed in men's clothing, refused to marry, and filled her palace with scholars, books, and art. She also had a reputation for rarely bathing, which became an unfortunate theme among royals of the era. Christina loved intellectual debates, but disliked the tedious rituals of monarchy. One morning, she simply decided she was done. She abdicated the throne at age 27, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome. There she spent her days hosting salons, befriending artists, and continuing to puzzle everyone who met her. She was a queen who treated ruling as a hobby she'd grown bored of, which, to be fair, is a very enviable position to be in. And then there's Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolph is remembered less for governing and more for collecting everything. He filled his Prague castle with what amounted to one of the earliest cabinets of curiosity. Stuffed animals, exotic plants, mechanical toys, astronomical instruments, paintings both sacred and bizarre. He had alchemists searching for the philosopher's stone in his basement, while court officials tried to remind him that wars were happening. He once spent hours gazing at exotic animals as if mesmerized, ignoring matters of state. Under his reign, the empire slid into chaos, but the art collection was magnificent. His obsessions gave us extraordinary cultural treasures, though his actual ruling ability was about as effective as leaving a raccoon in charge of the treasury. Meanwhile, the Russians contributed more than their share of peculiar habits. Take Tsar Peter the Great. He was obsessed with all things Western European and dragged Russia into modernity, sometimes literally by the beard. He imposed beard taxes on nobles, forcing men to either shave or pay for the privilege of looking like their ancestors. Those who resisted had their beards forcibly clipped, which probably didn't endear him to the upper classes. Peter also enjoyed working as a shipbuilder and carpenter. He would join common workers in the docks, hammer in hand, towering over them. Admirable, in theory, though one suspects his workers felt slightly less comfortable knowing the man handing them a plank of wood was also the autocrat who could execute them. From forced beards to fragile digestion, let's wander to Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth was famous for her sharp wit and political savvy, but she was also vain about her appearance. In later years, she insisted on layers of heavy white makeup to cover scars from smallpox. The mixture, made of lead and vinegar, slowly poisoned her skin. She would sit for hours as her ladies painted her face, producing a mask-like appearance. That alarmed ambassadors, but reassured her. She also demanded that no one mention her aging. Courtiers had to flatter her relentlessly, pretending she remained ageless and radiant. It must have been exhausting, offering poetic praise every time. She entered a room, knowing the alternative was career suicide. Her quirks kept the illusion alive, even as reality crept in. If we cross into Prussia, we find Frederick William I, also known as the Soldier King. His great obsession, very tall men. He created the Potsdam Giants, a regiment composed entirely of unusually tall soldiers. He sent agents across Europe to recruit, sometimes kidnap, anyone above average height. He bred tall soldiers with tall women in hopes of producing even taller offspring. The irony is that he rarely deployed them in battle. Instead, he paraded them around like living ornaments. He painted them, dressed them in elaborate uniforms, and admired them like a child showing off a collection of rare toys. For him, military might was less about strategy and more about spectacle. On the English side again, James I of England had his own peculiarities. He was terrified of witches, so much so that he personally wrote a treatise on demonology, describing, in serious detail, how to identify and prosecute them. He believed witchcraft had nearly killed him, and this paranoia seeped into national policy. Witch trials multiplied under his reign, many fueled by his personal obsession. He also had an unusual gait, described as lurching, and a habit of drooling. Courtiers had to endure long audiences as James rambled on about theology, while occasionally wiping his chin. For a man who ruled both England and Scotland, his quirks made him seem oddly mortal, even a bit shabby. Let's not forget Emperor Nero of Rome. Though not medieval or early modern, his quirks are too infamous to skip. Nero fancied himself a great artist and performer. He forced senators to attend his endless recitals, locking the doors so no one could leave. Some pretended to faint just to be carried out, an escape strategy that speaks volumes about the ordeal. He competed in chariot races despite lacking skill and predictably won every time, because who would dare defeat the emperor? His reign spiraled into chaos, but he remained convinced that history would remember him for his artistic talent. In a way, it did, just not in the flattering sense he hoped for. And finally, let's drift back to France for Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's quirks were many. He liked to dictate letters while soaking in a bath, sometimes for hours. He had unusual sleep habits, functioning on little more than catnaps, and contrary to rumor, he wasn't unusually short. He was average for his time. But his temper was famously small. One of his stranger habits was carrying sugar cubes in his pockets, which he would nibble between meetings. He was also obsessed with Josephine's scent, reportedly keeping her letters and even unwashed items of clothing. For a man who reshaped Europe, he carried himself at times like an anxious, eccentric schoolboy. All these quirks remind us, monarchy wasn't only about crowns and wars. It was also about small human habits that spiraled into legend. Kings terrified of witches, queens poisoning their own skin for beauty, emperors hoarding curiosities or tall soldiers. In the quiet of night, it's oddly comforting. The rulers of vast realms were just as peculiar, fragile, and petty as anyone else. Perhaps even more so. Sickly, spoiled and sad, royal childhoods. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, you've probably noticed by now that royals rarely had what we'd call normal lives. Tonight, let's wander through childhoods in palaces, gilded nurseries, filled with embroidered cradles, nervous tutors, and the occasional tragic medical condition, because royal children weren't allowed to just be children. They were dynastic chess pieces, burdened from the cradle with expectations of alliances, heirs and stability. And unfortunately, genetics and medieval medicine weren't especially kind to them. So let's begin with a few of the more fragile little rulers. We might start with Edward VI of England, the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Born in 1537, he was England's precious Protestant heir, which meant from day one, his existence carried the weight of national religion, dynastic survival, and decades of political bloodshed. Quite a lot for a newborn. Edward was a sickly child, thin, pale, prone to coughs and fevers. His tutors praised his intelligence, but also noted how fragile his body was. He loved learning languages and reading scripture, but he rarely had the energy for play. His health never truly recovered from a childhood of delicate lungs and endless medical treatments, which mostly made things worse. When he became king at age 9, his reign was little more than regency politics. He died at 15, leaving England spiraling into yet another succession crisis. His whole childhood, in hindsight, was one long prelude to a tragedy. From there, let's float to Mary, Queen of Scots, a baby who became a monarch at 6 days old. Her father, James V of Scotland, died suddenly in 1542, leaving his infant daughter as queen. A regent ruled in her name, while Mary grew up in a swirl of political bargaining. The English wanted her betrothed to Edward VI. The French wanted her whisked away to marry their dauphin. Everyone else just wanted to survive the chaos. So, Mary's childhood was less about toys and more about international treaties. At age 5, she was sent to France, where she grew up in splendor at the French court. Surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and raised like a living jewel, her youth was cushioned by luxury. But beneath it all, she remained the pawn of larger powers. Her brief happiness didn't last. Her adult life became one of prisons, betrayals, and eventually execution. It's almost as if royal children were allowed brief interludes of comfort, just to make the later downfall more poignant. Another sad little story is Charles II of Spain. Charles is, in many ways, the poster child for royal inbreeding. Born in 1661, his family tree was less a tree and more a wreath. His Habsburg heritage meant generations of cousin marriages, and Charles carried the full burden of it. From infancy, he was weak and sickly. His tongue was so large that he could barely speak until late childhood. He had trouble chewing, swallowing, and walking. Courtiers described him as constantly drooling and often bedridden. His mental development lagged behind as well. And yet, he was king. From the age of 4, entire factions fought for influence over this frail boy who could barely sit upright. His childhood was one long struggle against his own body, while his empire slowly unraveled. He died childless at 38, the final Spanish Habsburg, remembered more for his suffering than his reign. Now let's step back a bit to Louis XIII of France, son of Henry IV and Marie de Medici. Louis's childhood was defined by parental neglect. His father was assassinated when Louis was 8, leaving him technically king. His mother acted as regent, but largely ignored him, favoring her favorites and courtiers. As a boy, Louis developed a quiet, anxious personality. He stuttered. He was shy, awkward, and easily cowed. His tutors described him as melancholic, preferring solitary activities like hunting birds. It's not surprising, then, that as an adult, he relied heavily on Cardinal Richelieu to manage his kingdom. His childhood didn't prepare him to rule, it prepared him to survive being ignored. Royal children weren't always fragile. Sometimes they were just unbearable. Take Louis XV's children, for example. Louis had 10 of them, most of whom were spoiled with extravagant gifts, gowns, and toys. But their lives were tightly controlled. Every move was overseen by governesses. Every meal was formal. They were often separated from their parents, raised by strangers who enforced rigid etiquette. The result? They grew into a mix of nervous, spoiled, and resentful adults. Childhood for royal offspring wasn't filled with parental affection. It was filled with ceremony and suffocating expectations. They were prized possessions, not companions. We can also look at Ivan IV of Russia, later known as Ivan the Terrible. His childhood helps explain a lot. Ivan's father died when he was 3. His mother, who served as regent, was likely poisoned when he was 8. After that, he and his brother were neglected by the boyars, Russia's noble class, who used them as pawns. Ivan grew up in a palace filled with cruelty. He was often left without food or clothing. Servants beat him for sport. He spent his childhood watching power-hungry nobles tear his family apart. By age 13, Ivan had developed the charming habit of throwing animals off rooftops for entertainment. It's hardly surprising that he grew into a paranoid, violent adult who terrorized his subjects. His sad childhood blossomed into a nightmarish reign. Let's soften things slightly with Catherine de Medici's children in France. Catherine was mother to 3 kings of France, each of whom had a childhood shaped by fragility. Francis II was weak and constantly ill. Charles IX developed nervous tics and outbursts. Henry III, though more stable, grew up spoiled and eccentric. Their illnesses and insecurities made France vulnerable, with Catherine essentially running the kingdom from behind the scenes. Their sad little childhoods rippled outward into national instability, religious wars, and endless crises. It was one of those moments where the health of a nursery determined the fate of an entire country. Even in the grand courts of Austria, children weren't safe from dynastic burdens. Marie Antoinette, long before she was Queen of France, was a Habsburg archduchess. Her childhood was actually cheerful compared to most royals. She played in Schönbrunn Palace Gardens, enjoyed music lessons, and was doted on by her mother, Maria Theresa, but even her childhood wasn't free. At age 14, she was married off to the French Dauphin, leaving her home forever. Her girlish innocence and frivolity became her defining traits in Paris, where she struggled to adapt. What began as a playful, spoiled childhood ended with her infamous reputation as a frivolous queen, and eventually the guillotine. Royal nurseries were often paradoxical, surrounded by silks and servants, yet filled with loneliness, illness, and suffocating duty. Children like Edward VI, Charles II of Spain, and Ivan IV remind us that power didn't guarantee safety. In fact, it often guaranteed the opposite, and for every spoiled little prince, there was another coughing into velvet sheets, weighed down by diseases no physician could understand, while courtiers whispered about succession. So as you drift further into the night, picture these tiny monarchs, cradles rocking under gilded canopies, tutors murmuring Latin lessons, doctors prescribing ground pearls or leeches. Behind the splendor, there was fragility, and behind the fragility, there was always the shadow of dynastic expectation. Royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting through wedding halls draped in silk, candlelit banquets, and dynasties patting themselves on the back for securing the perfect match. Of course, perfect usually meant another cousin, another Habsburg, another fragile attempt to keep the crown in the family, literally. Romantic chemistry was irrelevant. Personal happiness wasn't even a consideration. The only thing that mattered was lineage, dowries, and politics. The result was a parade of weddings that looked splendid in paintings and rather disastrous in practice. Let's begin with the most infamous example, the Spanish Habsburgs. For generations, they married within their own family, sometimes looping the same ancestors into the tree 3 or 4 times. The idea was to keep their vast empire unified. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Americas all bound together. What they also bound together was a genetic mess. By the 17th century, the dynasty's crowning achievement was Charles II of Spain, whom we already met as a sickly child. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Their marriage wasn't unusual in that family. It was expected. But Charles inherited the worst cocktail of recessive traits imaginable. He was described by courtiers as more a corpse than a man. His tongue was too large for his mouth, his jaw jutted grotesquely, and he could barely chew. His marriages, predictably, failed to produce children. The once mighty Spanish Empire, carefully preserved through cousin marriage, collapsed with him. An entire dynasty undone by centuries of very determined inbreeding. Drifting north, let's look at the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII, with his 6 wives and desperate quest for a son, is infamous. But the real genetic disaster came from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, another case of strategic family union. Henry and Catherine's marriage produced multiple pregnancies, but most ended in stillbirth or early death. Their only surviving child was Mary Di. Historians have debated why. Was it syphilis? Was it some genetic incompatibility? We'll never know. But the outcome was a marriage that looked promising on paper and turned tragic in reality. Mary herself went on to marry Philip II of Spain, her cousin naturally. Their union was miserable, childless, and politically toxic. Mary endured phantom pregnancies, swelling as if expecting but delivering nothing, a haunting reminder of how these dynastic unions often left women humiliated and broken. Now, let's float toward the Austrian Habsburgs, who shared their Spanish cousins' enthusiasm for family weddings. Take Maria Anna of Austria, who married her own uncle, Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Anna was both niece and wife, which is already complicated enough. She was also the product of earlier cousin marriages. Unsurprisingly, their children weren't paragons of robust health. Several died young, and the survivors carried on. the family tradition of fragile constitutions and narrow jaws. And so the cycle continued. The Habsburgs perfected the art of keeping everything in the family, and everything predictably fell apart. Over in Russia, dynastic marriage also took its toll. Ivan IV the Terrible married multiple wives. Some were poisoned, some discarded. His children bore the brunt of his paranoia and the genetic fragility that plagued many noble houses. His son Fyodor the Fair was mentally impaired, described as gentle but incapable of ruling. His inability to produce heirs ended the Rurik dynasty, entirely plunging Russia into the time of troubles. So while Ivan's violent temperament made life unbearable, it was his family's fragile genetics that ensured dynastic collapse. A reminder that sometimes history's great dramas come down to whether a frail little boy could survive childhood. One of the more famous examples of genetic misfortune through marriage was hemophilia, the so-called royal disease. It began with Queen Victoria of Britain, who unknowingly carried the gene. Through her many children and their carefully arranged marriages, the condition spread through Europe's royal families. Her granddaughter Alexandra married Nicholas II of Russia, the last Tsar. Their son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia. A simple cut could be fatal. His constant suffering terrified his parents and made them susceptible to the influence of Rasputin, that wandering mystic who promised healing. So a genetic quirk from a marriage generations earlier ended up destabilizing an empire. Alexei's condition wasn't just tragic, it reshaped world history. Returning to Spain for a moment, consider Philip II of Spain again. Philip married 4 times. His first wife was his cousin Maria Manuela of Portugal, who died young after giving birth. Their only child, Don Carlos, was one of history's most unfortunate heirs. Don Carlos was sickly, deformed, and increasingly unstable. Accounts describe him as violent, paranoid, and cruel. He tortured animals. He once tried to burn servants alive. Eventually, his own father imprisoned him, where he wasted away and died at 23. A gruesome end. And another case of cousin marriage genetics turning tragic. Sometimes these dynastic unions weren't just unhealthy, they were profoundly miserable. Take Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette. Their marriage was meant to cement an alliance between France and Austria. Romantic compatibility was never considered. The problem: Louis and Marie Antoinette were barely teenagers when they married, and Louis was painfully awkward. For years, their marriage remained unconsummated. Courtiers whispered, Europe mocked them. Marie Antoinette grew lonely and reckless, turning to fashion and gambling for comfort. By the time they finally produced children, it was too late. The gossip had cemented her reputation as frivolous, and the revolution was already brewing. A political marriage gone wrong in more ways than one. The British royal family wasn't exempt either. In the 19th and 20th centuries, cousin marriages were still common. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were first cousins. Their union was genuinely affectionate, but the genetic fallout was less romantic. Several of their descendants inherited hemophilia, as mentioned, while others carried hereditary illnesses and nervous dispositions. By the time of World War I, European royalty was a tangled web of cousins, all at war with one another. Family dinners had essentially turned into global conflict, and then there's Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Yes, long before the Habsburgs, the Ptolemies were already perfecting cousin marriages. The dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, insisted on marrying brother to sister to preserve purity of blood. Cleopatra's own parents were almost certainly siblings. She herself married her younger brothers, as was tradition, though she quickly sidelined them in favor of alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The result? A dynasty so entangled with itself that by the time Cleopatra's children were born, genetic decline was already visible. Her son Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion, was described as weak and sickly, though little is known of his short life. The Ptolemies managed to demonstrate, centuries earlier, what the Habsburgs would later confirm. Marrying your sibling is not a long-term dynasty strategy. What's striking is how ordinary these arrangements seemed at the time. A medieval monarch marrying his niece. Entirely normal. A princess shipped off at 12 to marry her 40-year-old cousin. Expected. Love, compatibility and health were afterthoughts. The focus was always on alliance, territory and keeping crowns securely perched. And so, from Spain's collapsing Habsburgs to Russia's bleeding prince, dynasties paid the price. Beautiful weddings, tragic outcomes, splendid processions, followed by sickly heirs. As you drift further into sleep, imagine the endless royal banquets, velvet gowns, jewels glinting in candlelight, toasts to dynastic union, and behind the painted smiles the whispered fear. Will this marriage produce heirs? Will they survive? Or will the bloodline quietly rot from within? The pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. Hey everyone, tonight we're gliding into the quieter corners of palaces, marble halls echoing with arguments, tapestries hiding whispers, and kings and queens behaving with the emotional stability of toddlers. For all the ceremony, divine right and gilded crowns, many royals were astonishingly petty. Some refused to speak to their own children. Some waged wars over insults. Others sulked for years because someone else had the better title or the better horse. It turns out that when you give absolute power to fragile egos, you don't always get wisdom. Often, you just get tantrums dressed in velvet. Let's begin. With Richard II of England, Richard came to the throne as a boy and grew into a man with a remarkable flair for holding grudges. He was described as charming when he wanted to be, but hypersensitive, vain and convinced of his own grandeur. At banquets, he insisted on being addressed as Your Highness in tones of hushed reverence. If someone failed to meet his standards, he erupted. On one occasion, a knight annoyed him at dinner. Richard had him dragged outside and executed for ruining the vibe, but his true talent was pettiness. He feuded with his nobles constantly. When they dared to oppose him, he confiscated their estates, ruined their families, and declared them traitors. It wasn't enough to defeat an enemy. Richard needed them humiliated. Unsurprisingly, the nobles eventually had enough. They deposed him. Richard was locked away in Pontefract Castle, where he slowly starved to death. A dramatic fall for a man who believed himself too exalted for criticism. Moving across the Channel, let's drift to Louis XIII of France, the Sun King, the man who built Versailles and decided he was the literal center of the universe. Louis was not so much dysfunctional as he was theatrical. He loved ritual. Every morning, courtiers gathered to watch him get dressed. The honor of handing him a shirt was considered a great privilege. Of course, he made sure that courtiers competed bitterly for these meaningless tasks. Divide and conquer, through underwear. His pettiness came in more subtle forms. Louis insisted that Versailles be built in a swamp, partly to escape Paris, but also to force nobles into his glittering prison of etiquette. If they were busy arguing over who stood closest at his dinner table, they couldn't plot against him. He even controlled what colors they wore, what dances they performed, and how they bowed. Nobles were reduced to overgrown schoolchildren trying to please the headmaster, a king who micromanaged not through policy, but through pettiness disguised as magnificence. Now, for a sharper contrast, consider Ivan IV of Russia, known as Ivan. The terrible Ivan's reign was less petty, more apocalyptic. But his personal dysfunction shaped his rule. He was prone to violent mood swings. One day, he'd be generous, forgiving debts, showering gifts. The next, he'd unleash massacres. In his paranoia, he created the Oprichnina, a personal police, a force dressed in black, riding black horses, terrorizing the countryside. Entire towns were wiped out because Ivan suspected disloyalty, and yet his greatest act of dysfunction was domestic. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his son Ivan Ivanovich in the head, killing him. He murdered his heir in a tantrum. The succession was thrown into chaos, leaving Russia with his feeble son Fyodor, who barely spoke. Dysfunction on a family level, magnified into national catastrophe. Let's drift west again to Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's reign was a masterclass in personal drama, bleeding into politics. Her first marriage was to the sickly Francis II of France, who died young. Back in Nuneham, Scotland, she wed her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was vain, arrogant and insecure. He resented Mary's power. He drank heavily, picked fights, and sulked like a spoiled child. At one point, he stormed into her chambers while she was dining, stabbed her secretary David Rizzio in front of her, and left the corpse bleeding on the floor. Not exactly marital bliss. Mary, unsurprisingly, grew tired of him. Shortly afterward, Darnley was found dead, strangled, with his house mysteriously blown up. Subtlety was not her strong suit. She then married the chief suspect in the murder, the Earl of Bothwell. This caused such outrage that she was deposed, imprisoned, and eventually executed by Elizabeth I dynasty, crumbling not through war or a famine, but because of one very dysfunctional family triangle. On the subject of Elizabeth I, she had her own flavor of pettiness. Elizabeth never married, partly because she enjoyed dangling herself as a prize in diplomatic negotiations. But she was notoriously jealous of younger women at her court. If one of her ladies-in-waiting dared to get married without permission, Elizabeth reacted as though personally betrayed. In one case, when her favourite, the Earl of Leicester, secretly married Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth flew into a rage. She banished Lettice from court forever, referring to her as the she-wolf. And she never forgave Leicester, though she still kept him dangling in her circle. Elizabeth's court was less a place of governance, more a theatre of who could flatter the aging queen enough to avoid her wrath. Political power filtered through. Vanity. We can't forget Peter the Great of Russia. Peter dragged Russia into the modern age, building a navy, reforming the army, and forcing nobles to shave their beards. But his methods were erratic. He enjoyed personally conducting dental surgeries on his courtiers without anesthetic, as a kind of party trick. He staged mock weddings where dwarfs were forced into costumes and paraded through the streets for his amusement. He once executed his own son, Alexei, after suspecting him of treason. Beneath the grandeur of reform was a man with the temperament of a bored child, turning absolute power into a playground. Over in Spain, we return to Charles. To the tragic Habsburg, dysfunction didn't stop with his genetics. It extended to his daily life. Charles was so incapable of ruling that entire factions of courtiers controlled him like a puppet. He often believed he was bewitched, demanding exorcisms. Priests would force holy water down his throat while nobles squabbled over his throne. His marriages, arranged for heirs, produced nothing. He died convinced he had been cursed by witches. In reality, the curse was several centuries of his ancestors marrying each other. Perhaps the most absurd example of pettiness comes from Christian VII of Denmark. Christian became king in the 18th century, but he was mentally unstable. He babbled, incoherently, played childish pranks, and spent hours leaping about the palace. He preferred prostitutes to politics, and often ignored state affairs altogether. His physicians took control. One of them, Johann Struensee, became so influential that he essentially ran the kingdom. and also began an affair with the Queen. When this was discovered, Struensee was executed, the Queen banished, and Christian continued as king in name. Only a monarchy reduced to a dysfunctional puppet show, starring a king who barely understood what was happening around him. And then there's George III of Britain. George is remembered for losing the American colonies and for his bouts of madness. During his episodes, he babbled for hours, foamed at the mouth, and once tried to shake hands with a tree, believing it was the King of Prussia. His condition, possibly porphyria, became the subject of gossip and mockery. Ministers tried to hide his instability, but it was impossible. The king's madness turned Britain into a political chess game, with factions debating whether he was fit to rule. It's a reminder that sometimes a dynasty's greatest weakness wasn't war or rebellion, it was the mind of the monarch. As we drift through these stories, a pattern emerges. Kings and queens weren't grand strategists or enlightened rulers most of the time. They were fragile humans with outsized egos, unchecked power, and very few coping mechanisms. Their pettiness rippled outward. A sulking monarch could doom a marriage, a jealous queen could destroy careers, a violent tantrum could plunge nations into chaos. Behind the crown, dysfunction was the norm. And history, in its quiet, steady way, marched on. And so, as you drift into sleep, picture the glittering halls of Versailles, the cold towers of the Kremlin, the damp castles of England, all filled with royals bickering, sulking, and occasionally stabbing each other at dinner. Not exactly the picture of majesty, but deeply, humanly flawed. Part 11, sickly, spoiled, and sad. Medieval royal childhood's Hey Everyone. Tonight, let's turn down the candlelight and wander through the quieter rooms of medieval palaces, not the grand halls or throne rooms, but the nurseries, the cradles, the cold stone chambers where royal children grew up, often isolated, often fragile, and almost always misunderstood. It's easy to imagine them as fortunate, born into palaces, wrapped in velvet, attended by nurses and tutors, but the reality was often sadder. Royal children were political pawns before they were old enough to speak. They were married off as toddlers, sent abroad to strangers, and burdened with illnesses that no one properly understood, spoiled in some ways, neglected in others, and frequently very lonely. Let's begin with Edward VI of England. Edward was the long-awaited son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, heir to the Tudor dynasty. Everyone hoped he would grow into a strong king, continuing his father's power. Instead, Edward was a frail, sickly boy who spent most of his short life in careful seclusion. He was intelligent and studious, but weak. His tutors praised his piety, his knowledge of scripture, and his ability to write Latin compositions, yet he coughed constantly, grew thin, and by his teenage years it was obvious he was dying. When he became king at 9 years old, he was essentially a puppet. Councillors ruled in his name while Edward played the part of monarch. He scribbled in his diary, recording small details, "I had peas for dinner," in a voice that feels more like a child trying to sound serious than a king. He died at 15, probably of tuberculosis. The great Tudor hope extinguished in the pale body of a boy who never had a chance. Contrast him with Louis XIII of France, who grew up in an atmosphere of paranoia and manipulation. His father, Henry IV, was assassinated when Louis was just 9. Suddenly, the shy, awkward boy became king. His mother, Marie de Medici, took over as regent and smothered him with control. Louis developed a stammer, a nervous disposition, and a deep resentment of those around him. His childhood was a cocktail of pressure and insecurity. Courtiers mocked him behind his back. He struggled to assert himself. He found solace in hunting, music, and a small circle of favorites. But emotionally, he never really grew up. As king, he could be indecisive and melancholy. He leaned heavily on Cardinal Richelieu to make decisions. A reminder that the insecure boy in the nursery never really left. Now let's drift further north to Eric of Pomerania, king of the Kalmar Union in the 15th century. Eric wasn't even born into the role. He was adopted as heir by his grand aunt, Queen Margaret I of Denmark. As a child, he was plucked from his family, renamed, and raised to be the symbol of a new united Scandinavia. Imagine being a young boy told, essentially, "Forget who you are. From now on, you're a king." He grew into an arrogant, stubborn ruler who feuded constantly with his nobles. He taxed heavily, fought costly wars, and ignored advice. Many blamed his troubled childhood, an identity cut short, a role forced onto him, for the coldness of his reign. Eventually, he was deposed and lived out his later years as a pirate. A childhood pawn turned dysfunctional adult. We can't forget Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. Mary was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Her childhood was turned upside down when Henry divorced her mother. Overnight, Mary went from being a cherished princess to a bastard, stripped of her status, forced to serve in the household of her baby half-sister Elizabeth. She adored her mother, Catherine, and the forced separation scarred her. Mary's letters from this time are heartbreaking. Pleased to see her mother again, pleased to be restored to her father's love. Henry ignored them. This early trauma shaped Mary's adult life. She grew into a queen obsessed with legitimacy, with restoring Catholicism, with undoing the humiliations of her youth. The cruelty of her reign reflected the cruelty of her childhood. Another tragic figure is Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. As a boy, Charles was healthy, athletic, and charming. He enjoyed tournaments and hunts. But his childhood was marked by instability, regents squabbling for power, factions tearing the court apart. When Charles was in his 20s, the first signs of mental illness appeared. He attacked his companions in a sudden frenzy, killing several. Later, he forgot his own name, insisted he was made of glass, and had to be restrained to prevent injury. Historians often wonder whether the stresses of his childhood, loneliness, political manipulation, constant pressure, played a role in the breakdown of his mind. A boy raised without stability, growing into a king without sanity. One of the saddest childhoods belongs to Ivan IV of Russia, before he became the terrible Ivans. Father died when he was 3. His mother, the regent, died when he was 8, possibly poisoned. From then on, the boy was raised by quarreling boyars who neglected him. Ivan grew up hungry, poorly clothed, ignored. He later recalled how he and his brother would beg for scraps of food while nobles feasted. By his teens, Ivan was already lashing out, torturing animals, throwing cats from palace roofs, and terrifying servants. This was the formative childhood of a Tsar, a neglected, abused boy who grew into a man consumed by paranoia and cruelty. Sometimes the sadness was less dramatic, more subtle. Take Anne of Brittany, Queen of France. She was betrothed and married off repeatedly as a child. First engaged at age 6, married at 14 to the King of France, who died 2 years later, then married again to his cousin. Her entire childhood was negotiations and ceremonies, her body treated as a diplomatic prize. Imagine being a teenager, and your greatest achievement is uniting 2 kingdoms through marriage. There was little room for joy, play, or freedom, or consider Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, the heir to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Alfonso was adored, the shining star of Spain's future, but he died at 16, probably from plague. His death devastated his parents and shifted the succession to his sister Juana, who became Juana la Loca, the Mad. A single sickly boy's death changed the course of Spanish history. Behind every royal dynasty was the fragile body of a child, easily extinguished by disease. Royal nurseries were filled with contradictions, luxurious clothes but drafty rooms. Dozens of servants, but little genuine affection. Lessons in Latin and theology, but no time to simply be children. They were spoiled with jewels and toys, yet denied stability. They were isolated from ordinary life, yet paraded as symbols of dynastic power. The result was predictable. Kings and queens who were insecure, suspicious, often emotionally stunted. Their childhoods were not golden beginnings, but cages. And so, as you close your eyes, imagine those palaces not in their grandeur, but in their quieter moments. A pale boy coughing into silken sheets. A lonely girl writing letters to a mother she will never see again. Children playing with gilded toys, already carrying the weight of kingdoms. Spoiled, yes, sickly often, sad almost always. Part 12. Strange Habits and Royal Dining Disasters. Hey everyone, tonight let's leave the nurseries behind and wander into the dining halls of Europe's royals. Not the glittering images painted by court artists, but the reality of what they ate, how they ate it, and the strange rituals they invented to make eating appear more majestic than it ever needed to be. Because if there's one thing royals were reliably bad at, it was food. Their habits were strange. Their diets were often disastrous, and their feasts sometimes resembled medical emergencies more than meals. And yet, these were the tables where politics, power, and pettiness were all digested at once. Let's begin with Henry VIII, since he was basically the poster child for bad royal eating. Henry had all the resources of England at his disposal, which meant moderation was never on the menu. He started as a slim, athletic young man, but by middle age, his eating habits had caught up with him. Whole roasted swans, mountains of beef, constant pies filled with venison, rabbit, or pork. He washed it all down with gallons of ale and wine, vegetables, rare, fruit, only in sauces or tarts drowned in sugar. Henry's idea of balance was alternating between venison and beef. By the end, he was enormously overweight, plagued by ulcers on his legs and unable to walk without assistance. His doctors bled him, purged him, and applied poultices that did nothing. It turns out, a diet of constant red meat and sugar was not conducive to royal longevity. Now, Henry wasn't unique. Across Europe, meat was the ultimate royal status symbol. Take Philip IV of Spain, nicknamed the Planet King. He consumed vast quantities of beef and game, usually drenched in heavy sauces. He also had an unfortunate fondness for sweets, which were considered fashionable. By middle age, he was overweight and suffered from chronic digestive problems. Court records politely describe him as indisposed after feasts. Translation, bedridden with stomach cramps. His descendants, the later Habsburgs, continued this tradition of indulgence, combined with a genetic pool that was already rather fragile. The result was a line of monarchs who were simultaneously gluttonous and physically weak. And then there's Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who turned dining into theatre. Louis believed eating should be a performance. Each day he held the Grand Couvert, a public meal where courtiers could watch him eat. Imagine sitting in silence while the King of France messily devoured roast fowl with his fingers, and you've got the picture. Louis had a huge appetite. He loved game, especially partridge and pheasant, as well as rich stews and endless pastries. He could consume 4 full bowls of soup before even starting the main course. Doctors warned him gently that this might not be ideal. Louis ignored them naturally. By old age, he suffered from gout, tooth loss, and chronic digestive issues. Yet he kept performing, eating with an audience, because for him, food wasn't just sustenance, it was monarchy on display. Of course, not all royals indulged in excess. Some had habits that were simply strange. James I of England, for instance, had a notorious fear of being poisoned. At meals, he insisted on elaborate rituals to ensure nothing was tampered with. His food was tasted multiple times before it reached him. His cutlery was carefully inspected. Even his napkins were checked. Despite all this paranoia, James had very plain tastes. He preferred simple meats, bread, and wine. He once complained that elaborate banquets gave him headaches. In other words, he lived in fear of being assassinated over a plate of chicken he barely wanted to eat. Charles II of England had different issues. He adored fruit, particularly peaches, which he ate in such quantities that his doctors begged him to stop. He also had a weakness for chocolate, which had just become fashionable in Europe. Charles had it imported, whipped into sweet drinks, and consumed like medicine. Of course, chocolate in the 17th century was thick, bitter, and often spiced with chili or pepper. But Charles drank it constantly, convinced it was both healthy and glamorous. His teeth, predictably, did not thank him. Then we have Peter the Great of Russia, whose habits were less about indulgence and more about chaos. Peter loved to drink, ferociously, relentlessly, with little pause. Banquets in his court often devolved into drinking contests, where guests were pressured to down vast quantities of vodka or beer. Peter invented a drunken synod of mock priests, whose only role was to drink and sing bawdy songs during feasts. As for food, Peter wasn't picky. He enjoyed simple fare, black bread, salted fish, cabbage soup. But his dining rituals were destructive. Guests were forced to drink until they collapsed. Foreign ambassadors dreaded invitations, knowing they'd leave with ruined dignity and a headache that could last days. For Peter, dining was less about eating and more about demonstrating dominance over his body, over his court, over anyone foolish enough to sit at his table. Of course, sometimes the disasters weren't intentional. Take Charles VIII of France, who died not in battle, but by walking into a low doorway while heading to watch a tennis match after dinner. He struck his head, collapsed, and never recovered. It's a reminder that after the feasts came digestion, and after digestion came accidents. Or George IV of Britain, whose appetite was legendary even by Hanoverian standards. He devoured enormous meals, guzzled alcohol, and ballooned in size. By middle age, he was so overweight he could barely mount a horse. He had special corsets made to hold in his stomach. His dinners were spectacles of indulgence, but behind the scenes, he battled constant pain, gout, and dependence on laudanum. Guests were dazzled by the feasts. George, meanwhile, struggled to walk. Sometimes the disasters came in the form of food poisoning, though royals rarely admitted it. Henry I of England, son of William the Conqueror, reportedly died after eating a surfeit of lampreys. Essentially, too many eels. His doctors warned him the fish were bad for his health. He ignored them. Naturally, he died shortly after. The chroniclers, in their dry way, note that he died against the advice of his physicians, which is a medieval way of saying he really should not have had that second plate. Even stranger were the rituals of court banquets. In Burgundy, elaborate feasts featured dishes sculpted into symbolic forms, like castles made of pastry or entire animals reassembled after cooking. Guests were expected to marvel even as the food cooled and became inedible. In England, swans and peacocks were served with their feathers reattached, creating the illusion of a living bird on the platter. The meat, by this point, was usually tough and stringy. But no one complained, because complaining about a roasted feathered swan in the 15th century was social suicide. Then there were the fastidious eaters, Elizabeth I of England. Despite presiding over a court famous for feasting, was actually rather cautious. She preferred simple dishes and was known for her fondness for sweetmeats and candied fruits. Unfortunately, she consumed so much sugar that by old age, her teeth had blackened and rotted. Foreign ambassadors described her smile with diplomatic horror. Elizabeth also had a habit of picking at food rather than eating heavily. Banquets were for show. Her real meals were light, sometimes just bread and wine. One cannot forget Maximilian I of Austria, who had a peculiar obsession with fish. He insisted on eating it constantly, believing it to be healthier than meat. Unfortunately, this left him with recurring digestive problems. His doctors prescribed even more fish, which made things worse. It's a reminder that medieval medicine often took a bad habit and doubled down on it. And then there were the royal pets at table. Several monarchs allowed their favorite animals to join them for meals. Louis XV of France often fed his dogs from his own plate. Henry III of France once dined with his pet monkeys, who had a reputation for attacking courtiers. It was less majestic feast and more awkward picnic at the zoo. What unites all these stories is the way food became both indulgence and burden. Royals ate to show power, to demonstrate wealth, to display divine favor. But in reality, the meals often left them sick, overweight, or paranoid. The dining halls echoed with laughter and ceremony, but behind closed doors, doctors were summoned for indigestion, gout, and mysterious cramps. Strange habits, strange disasters, and a reminder that too much privilege rarely makes for healthy appetites. And so, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those long wooden tables, the candlelight flickering over silver platters, the smell of roasted meats, heavy sauces, sweet pastries, courtiers whispering, dogs begging underfoot, monarchs chewing noisily while their physicians wince in the background. Royalty never dined simply. They dined strangely, excessively, and disastrously. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. From fragile dynasties to disastrous dinners, we've drifted through the odd corners of royal life. It turns out crowns rarely came with common sense. They inherited power, but also ailments, anxieties and appetites. Their feasts left them sick, their marriages left them miserable, and their legacies were often more comical than grand. And yet, through all the petty quarrels and peculiar habits, they shaped the world we live in. Strange reminders that history is rarely noble. It's usually just human. So as you settle deeper into rest, let the noise of the banquet hall fade away. Close your eyes and let the flicker of candlelight dim into sleep. Good night, and may history keep you company until morning.